Well, we are going to get you all the details of these stories, but for the time being, the focus is going to be very disturbing visuals which have been coming out of the Israel-Hamas wall. The Al-Shifa Hospital, it has been rendered completely dysfunctional. This, remember, is the largest hospital in Gaza, which is currently in the midst of a fight between the IDF, the Israeli forces, and the Hamas terrorists. In fact, all the fuel meant to help the hospital in saving lives have now been snatched away by the Islamist terror group. People are now being deprived of their basic rights, hospitals, which are now being turned into terror headquarters, as per Israel. In fact, UN's aids have been misused by the terror group as well, and civilians have been left to suffer with no treatment. Babies have been allowed to die, 6 of them in this hospital alone in the last 6 days, when there has been a power cut. Well, the war has taken a toll on these innocents who are being forced to pay this price of war. But Israel, on the other hand, is not only dismantling terror, but also has been helping, it claims, the people of Gaza. Upon hearing about the energy crisis at Al-Shifa Hospital, Israeli forces risked their lives to hand-deliver 300 liters of fuel to the Shifa Hospital for urgent medical purpose. But guess what? Abu Rish, the Director General of Hamas Health Ministry, has rejected this aid of fuel sent in by Israel, while putting lives of people at peril. Listen into this conversation. It has been released by the Israeli forces. They say this is how Hamas has refused to allow Israeli forces deliver fuel to those who are ailing in the Al-Shifa Hospital.
حتى اللحظة دي في مشكلة بس في الشفا طورها قريبا.
شو الصيغة؟
يعني أبو الريش ما بدوش الكمية بنحاول نقنع فيه.
Well, the IDF, on the other hand, is doing everything it can to mitigate the harm which has come to the civilians of Gaza, and has also said that it is increasing the humanitarian aid, and has reiterated that the war against Hamas and is not against the people of Gaza per se.
October 7th is the day our world stopped. Hamas started a war, brutally butchering, raping, and burning over 1,200 civilians, as well as kidnapping hundreds of people. It's been 38 days since. Babies, women, children, and the elderly, 239 innocent people, all being held hostage by Hamas in Gaza. Ever since October 7th, the IDF has 2 goals: eliminating Hamas and bringing back our hostages. The IDF has repeatedly stated, our war is with Hamas, not with the people of Gaza. We're doing everything we can to mitigate harm to civilians and increase humanitarian aid. We've employed tactical pauses in specific areas of northern Gaza in an additional effort to facilitate the safe, temporary evacuation of civilians southward. We've also been encouraging the evacuation of patients treated in hospitals used by Hamas as terrorist bases, including the elimination of Hamas terrorists who was holding 1,000 Gazan civilians hostage in the Rantisi hospital, clearly using them as human shields. A safe passage is open on Al-Wahda Street from Shifa Hospital to allow civilians a safer route from the hospital to the south. Thousands of people have already evacuated the hospital. In the last 24 hours, the IDF has delivered 300 liters of fuel to Shifa Hospital's doorstep, yet the fuel remains untouched after Hamas threatened hospital staff. These continued efforts all follow our 2 goals: eliminate Hamas and bringing back our hostages. We will do whatever is necessary so that something like the October 7th massacre never happens again.
Well, in fact, let's go across to Major Libby Weis, who's joining us as spokesperson with the IDF. Thank you so much, Major Weis, for joining us here on Times Now. Well, it has been 38 days since the war began. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza has been troubling the world. What would you say about that?
Well, first, I think it's important to clarify that we are not targeting the civilians in the Gaza Strip. And if things were to go as we have hoped, then there wouldn't be any civilians who would be injured or pay any price in the Gaza Strip. And unfortunately, Hamas has no regard for their own civilians. And we are seeing that time and time again. We have instructed civilians now for several weeks to move from the northern part of the Strip to the southern part of the Strip. More than 900,000 have moved, but we know that Hamas is making it very, very difficult for them to do so. We've provided humanitarian aid. More than 1,000 trucks have gone in with humanitarian goods. That includes food, water, and medication. But we know that Hamas has a very strong control over everything that's going on within the Gaza Strip, and certainly has little regard for the well-being of their own people, unfortunately.
Well, in fact, the IDF has said that they tried their best to send in fuel to the Al-Shifa Hospital, which is, of course, the biggest hospital in Gaza. There are reports which are coming in that thousands of them have fled, but many of them cannot. You've said that there is an ultimatum which has been given repeatedly. They've been asked to move out of this area. However, many of them, and this includes babies as well, who are trapped inside, for example, the Al-Shifa Hospital, those who are unable to leave and flee.
Well, we are in close communication with the heads of Shifa Hospital to find a way to facilitate the movement of people from the hospital outside of it. But again, I think this really speaks to the just disregard that Hamas has for their own civilians. Of course, Hamas is the sovereign in the Gaza Strip. They are responsible for the well-being of civilians there. And effectively, we, the Israeli military, are now the only party in this conflict that has any regard for civilians. And it's devastating and I think a huge just tragedy to the Palestinian people as well, that Hamas does not make the necessary and simple efforts that would be involved to evacuate civilians generally, and certainly to evacuate civilians within a hospital. And instead, they're using the hospital for their own terror purposes.
It's interesting you are saying that, because just a few hours back, the health ministry of Gaza, which is of course ruled by the Hamas itself, has come out and said that of late, in one day alone, there have been 6 babies who've died prematurely. And this, as per them, the reason behind that is the lack of fuel, the lack of electricity, the lack of food, even medicines, which they could not provide. But it's quite interesting if we juxtapose it with what the WHO director has said. He said, regrettably, hospital is not functioning as a hospital anymore. What would you say about that? The fact that human shields are being used, and that too made out of babies, those who are injured, those who are stuck.
Well, I think it speaks to the depravity that Hamas has and the disregard for their own civilian population. Hamas is responsible for evacuating those civilians. We have, because we don't want to impact the civilians there, and because the goal here is to target Hamas and not civilians anywhere in the Strip, but certainly not within the hospital, we have instructed for several weeks for people to move. We have created tactical pauses to allow the movement of civilians. We are creating every possible situation on the ground to enable civilians to move and for the hospital to receive fuel, as you mentioned in your report. And the fact that Hamas is putting pressure on civilians in the hospital is criminal, and I think it speaks to the disregard that they have for their own people.
Now, Major Weis, it's very interesting that back in 2014, you yourself were part of Operation Protective Edge. This was against the Hamas in Gaza. You were inside some of these terror tunnels that you were explaining to us about. Can you tell us what they are like, since you have been in one of them extensively at that?
Sure. So I think the best way to think of the tunnels is really to imagine that there is Gaza above ground and then there is Gaza underground. And when I went into one of these tunnels in 2014, I was struck by how advanced they were, by the engineering of these tunnels, by the concrete and the engineering that went into building them. These were impressive tunnels. All made with concrete pieces, all exactly the same size, structurally sound, were wired for electricity. It's very clear that Hamas has invested millions and millions of dollars in their tunnel network. And the tunnels that exist now under Gaza are being used by Hamas to store and to move people, weapons, supplies, infrastructure, rather than invest this money in Gaza above ground, which would be Gaza for the civilians.
to think they could have used even a fraction of this money to try and build bunkers for their civilians. But Major Weis, it's interesting that you're giving us a detail of what these tunnels really look like. You must also explain to us what really were these tunnels being used and how deep are these tunnels? Because many have said that that may be one of the reasons, and you can perhaps tell us about it, is the reason why the IDF does not want to storm and go inside the tunnels. They do not want a full-on offensive inside the tunnels because it may simply be a trap.
Well, we know that Hamas has invested significantly in these tunnels, but we also, on the IDF side, are aware, and this is not a new threat. We unfortunately are aware of long use that Hamas has had of these tunnels, and we certainly will be prepared to handle the threat anywhere that it comes from Hamas. But I think really your comment on the investment here is tragic, and to think that Hamas could have invested not only in shelters, but in perhaps trying to create a peaceful future side by side with us and a better reality for their own people, and instead have invested millions in the tunnels, in the rockets that they have, in all of the terror infrastructure is a real tragedy.
Absolutely. Now, Major Weis, President Netanyahu has said that there is going to be absolutely no ceasefire till the 240 hostages are released. Any details emerging on that? Are you really hoping that that is going to happen, which will be the only solution, the only resolution to this war?
Well, I will let the politicians sort of deal on the more political side. Our focus is on doing whatever we can at this stage and with the mandate that we have to get the hostages back. The fastest way, and perhaps it almost seems obvious, but I think it's an important message to say that the fastest way for all 239 people who are being held would be for Hamas to release them immediately, without any terms or conditions or demands. These are civilians, and just last week we saw a really disturbing video that Hamas released of a 13-year-old hostage and a 77-year-old hostage.
Yes.
It's just clear psychological warfare and another element of their campaign to terrorize the Israeli public. But the fastest way for them to come home would be for Hamas to release them immediately, and for international pressure to be put on Hamas to release these civilians, a 13-year-old, a 77-year-old, a 10-month-old baby, for them to be released immediately and to come home today.
Absolutely. And I'm going to ask you this two-pronged question. First, as a soldier and also as an Israeli. How does it all end? Because we can see that Israel right now is circled, is encapsulated by this axis of evil. Of course, there are other psychological wars which are happening on social media. Let's not forget the disinformation. How does it all end? Can there be a comprehensive, a long-term solution to this?
Well, I think part of this question is perhaps for the political level and the diplomats to be able to discuss. From our perspective, the military goal is a very clear one, and that is to make sure that Hamas terrorists never harm Israelis ever again. And of course, we look forward to a day where we can live peacefully with all of our neighbors, but we will do whatever we have to defend our country and to continue living here. It's our home, and we plan on staying here.
Well, thank you so much, Major Libby Weis, for joining us. Now, that's one of the credible voices, someone who's been inside these terror tunnels of Hamas, who's telling us what hopefully is going to be a solution, a long-term solution. Militarily is going to be the end of Hamas, and nothing short of that for Israel. I thank you so much for joining us, Major, on this show. Well, this is one of the voices that you have heard coming in from Israel. Unfortunately, after 38 days, there's still no resolution which has come to this war.